I read Ghostwritten by David Mitchell. Ghostwritten almost feels like a fix-up novel where you take like a bunch of short stories and knit them together into a longer novel. But it's clearly just a structure that Mitchell is familiar with. I've read this book before, and I've read all of his other books as of the time of the podcast coming out. And so this is a reread for me, and I'm also thinking about it in the context of the other books. I plan to read all of the other books in publishing order after this, and then talk about the connections between them. So I won't spoil the connections in a forward motion way. So when I read the next book, I'll talk about how it is connected to this book, for example. So this book has 9 different parts with 8 different characters who have an interconnected kind of experience of living in a globalized world under a kind of Western influence in a modern context. Some of it, time and space, move around quite a bit. Some of it takes place in the earlier part of the 20th century, and some of it feels like it passes our current moment and maybe even goes into the future or a kind of imagined future of the early 2000s. But to talk about characters, we start off in Japan with a character who calls himself Quasar. It's really interesting to me how Quasar is presented as a very ironic character. Like, we immediately have bad feelings about him. He is out of touch with reality. He's committed a heinous act of terrorism, and we can see inside of his thoughts how completely deluded and disconnected from other people he is. So there's like a very ironic presentation of the character. It's not straightforward at all. But at the same time, the book is kind of setting up a sense of what's possible. Like, his thoughts about, like, I have gamma emanations and alpha emanations, it all seems very ridiculous and stupid. It's part of why you don't take the character very seriously and why you consider him to be delusional. He's clearly part of a cult. He is out of touch with modern sensibilities. And in that way, he really is like an outsider in exactly the way that his name implies, being a quasar. However, by the time you finish the novel, you have completely accepted all kinds of psychic phenomenon, including ghosts, including kind of transcendental abilities of consciousness to move from one body to another, and the idea of a bodiless AI consciousness by the end of the book. And so a lot of the things that Quasar believes in that seem ridiculous at the beginning of the book, by the end of the book, seem completely plausible and are in fact confirmed. It's just that he doesn't have the kind of juice that he thinks he does. He thinks that he's very powerful, but he's just a stooge. He's just fooling himself in a lot of ways. But that doesn't mean that he's not connected to other people, because the book is not just about like psychic or supernatural phenomenon. That's a kind of motif that it's using. The story seems much more concerned with ideas of cause and effect. So I see a structure in the book of handing off cause and effect. And so you have Quasar, causing this terrorist attack to happen, and the effect that it has on him and his like sense of denial around all of his, like, I was doing it for the greater good, but there's still like a horror and guilt deep inside of him. And this choice that he made to kill the people on the train and the way that that event was humanized for him by staring into the eyes of a toddler, a little girl, is like tearing him apart inside. So there's a cause and effect that happens directly for Quasar, but for the rest of the book, I think you can kind of draw a line between like one story creates a cause, and then in the next story, we see its effect. So in the story of Neil Brose, we see a lawyer who is involved in money laundering and shady business deals and bad accounting practices that cover up criminal enterprises that are doing their banking with him, but are involved in all kinds of stuff all over the world. And when the corruption is uncovered because of his death in the story, the consequences of that roll out throughout the rest of the book. And so you'll see, like, Marco's book contract is probably going to get canceled because the funding for that comes from this illicit bank account. The deals that are happening with the Mongolian gangster and KGB, ex-KGB guy are wrapped up in that whole thing. The St. Petersburg criminals who are doing a art heist have their bankroll affected by the whole thing. And so you just see like lots of ripple effects of this cause creating lots of effects all throughout the rest of the story. I think Neil Brose is also interesting to get back to the supernatural stuff because he is living in an apartment that is haunted, but also his living situation is like situated in some bad feng shui. He has some unlucky numbers associated with where he lives, and then he's directly across from an elevator, which means that it will eat all of his luck. And he, in that way, like he's very kind of not connected to his particular place where he lives. Like he's a guy from England who's living in Hong Kong because he's chasing a certain lifestyle that has nothing to do with like who he is. And that kind of displacement is symbolized in the story, I think, to an extent by this supernatural stuff. Like his life is all messed up because like he can't have children, for example. So there's a ghost child there, and he's not willing to acknowledge or deal with the effects that his infertility have on his relationship. He compartmentalizes all of his shortcomings. He tries to like run away from being the son of a poor fisherman from England by like going to the other side of the world. And by running away from those things, it like creates ghosts and bad luck and what have you symbolically in the story. Or at least I think that's one way to read it. It's the way that I kind of read it. And I kind of skipped over there the whole story of Satoru, and I think that's another part of the structure of the story here. So we have the 9 parts. We start off with Quasar, and we actually, like, the next story is Satoru's story, who also lives in Japan. I think he lives in Tokyo, if I remember right. Satoru's kind of like a slacker musician who contemplates what it takes to live in Tokyo, and that when you're in this very interconnected society, you have 2 versions of yourself. You have an exterior self and an interior self, and that you have to cultivate that interior life. And for Satoru, that is the world of jazz and of music. And you see that theme played out again and again when it comes to interiority and exteriority. And like I was saying with Neil Bros, he has all of these interior compartments. He has a very complicated interior life that is actually designed to protect his most interior self from awareness, consequences, responsibility, and any of those kind of things, which I think is yet another layer of structure in the story. So we go from like a pretty bad person in Quasar to a pretty good and likable person in Sataru to another bad person in Neil Bros. And then after Neil's story, we go to the unnamed T-Shack lady, who is a very sympathetic and good character, I would say. And so there's this contrast of different types of people, right? As we move through the story of like good, bad, good, bad. And then they create a chain of cause and effect as they move throughout the story. So like Quasar at one point uses a payphone to try and get more resources, and he drops like a code word at a remembered phone number. But the phone number that he's calling, whether it was intentional or not, is the music CD store that Sataru works at. And the effect of the phone call is that Sataru meets a girl that he has kind of formed an infatuation with just on first sight, but by meeting each other, because he went back into the store to answer this phone call, it leads to a love affair that seems to last for years as far as like the details that we get sprinkled throughout the rest of the novel. And Sataru's relationship with this young woman is directly, I think her name is Tomoyo. His relationship with this young woman manifests itself in front of Neil Bros when he runs into them having a date in Hong Kong at one point, and he feels a strong sense of envy, but also of kind of an embittered sense of his own romantic past. And it's part of what he is like constantly rejecting all of these things that are put in front of him, and also thinking about his past and what he regrets as he slowly succumbs to a diabetic episode that kills him. And so, it's a cause that they get into a relationship, Sataru and Tomoyo, and the effect is that Neil yet again rejects himself, rejects an interior part of himself, rejects love, the idea of love, has a cynical reaction to it, and that contributes to his disconnection from everyone around him and directly leads to his death. The T-Shack lady is really interesting. It's probably like the emotional core of the book. I remember the first time that I read it, it was the most affecting story for me. A lot of people that I've seen who review the book really love that part of the story. And I think it's the part of the story that makes me think the most of the work of the Russian intellectual Mikhail Bakhtin, who came up with ideas around like, what is the novel? How does it operate? How is it different from other pieces of art? And his conclusions have to do with the idea of time and space, which are both like really important themes in this book, but also the underlying kind of metatextual voice of the author that has to do with their psychological disposition on the state of the world. And I think this is really important for understanding Mitchell's work in particular. So Bakhtin has kind of two ideas around that have to do with one, the monological, which is a disposition where you believe that there are certain things about the world that are simply true and certain things about the human disposition and the way that people are that are simply true. There are moral truths that are absolute and don't matter in terms of your perspective. And then everything in the book is kind of a ratified manifestation of that monological perspective. And so things can come off as kind of preachy, I guess. Like they just come off as like, here is a sermon or a parable that shows how I see the world, and all of these people are kind of puppets for explaining how I think people are deep down. And then he has the other idea that's kind of the opposite, in which I think he thinks is way better and is the actual soul of the novel, the thing that makes it different, which is the polyphonic voice. And that's exactly the way that it sounds, that one author is able to give voice to many different perspectives, and all of those various perspectives actually illustrate like a deeper humanity that creates a rich tapestry, giving a kind of simulated life that other forms of art struggle and can't really achieve compared to the novel, because it's all interior to your own experience. And so you have characters who, some of them believe in the supernatural existence of God, for example, and other people are atheists. And the story doesn't go in one direction or the other, that this person is right and this person is wrong, and punishing one of them and rewarding the other in a very like heavy-handed allegorical kind of way. Instead, there's a very kind of even-handed and more nuanced position that the novel will cultivate if it's polyphonic. And I think that Mitchell's work overall is about polyphony and about the many different kinds of people that exist in the world, but also the necessary presence that they have to create the rich story that his world creates. That and in a way that like it takes all of us as human beings to create this world that we all live in together, even if we find some of the people to be villainous and other people to be naive. It still takes all of those people to make the world that we live in, this complicated polyphonic space that we all inhabit. And the Tea Shack lady, to get back to the actual story instead of talking about Mikhail Bakhtin's thoughts, is one of the most polyphonic areas in a lot of ways. That she has a kind of almost saintly existence. For one thing, we don't know her name, which is super interesting. And then she goes through like so many different, very difficult trials, tribulations. She lives through the end of World War II, the rise of communism, the different forms that communism has taken throughout Chinese history, leading up all the way to the end of the 20th century, and doing it all in one space, but having that flow of time happen over a very extended period if you compare it to the interludes that we had with Quasar, Satoru, Neil Brose before her. She has a much wider breadth of time than they do. But at the same time, her connection to time itself spans the entire novel. At one point, she is able to perceive the AI satellite over, going over the place in China that she is, but it doesn't exist yet. And yet she does correctly perceive its existence in the future. And she's able to communicate with herself at various points in the story through time. So when she was very young and upset, she has a communication with a spirit that tells her to trust in her tree and not worry, and everything will turn out okay. And then later, when she's an old lady, she is actually on the other end of that conversation. And so she was speaking to herself in the past. And so time is kind of collapsed for her in a special way, in exactly the same way I think also that her space is highly, highly fixed, even compared to the other characters who happen to be in the place that they were, but it's only because they didn't have much time to go anywhere else. The other thing about her talking to herself is that it hits back on that idea that Satoru has, that you need to have an interior and an exterior version, or you need to double yourself in some way. And Neil Bros also has this idea of doubling himself, or even more than doubling himself, because he has all these different compartments, is how he thinks of it, that he deals with this problem over here and that problem over there. And none of the problems intersect with each other inside of him. And so later on in the story, when we get to Marco, he talks to a guy who saw a double of himself, or maybe a ghost of himself. He's not sure. It's like a ghost story, he says. And Margarita also seems to have a conversation with a woman who is some aspect of herself or a version of herself later in the story as well. And so there's the theme or idea of doubling and meeting yourself happens to most of the characters in the story. Even literally, Neil kind of meets a guy who is an investigator, and he used to be a kind of scumbag lawyer, banker type dude, the same way that Neil is. But he made like a different choice to become someone who catches the criminals instead of being the criminal. And so it's a different version of what Neil could be, represents a choice that he could make, but that he doesn't do because of the money and all of the other rewards. And while the tea shack lady is running her place, she has a tree that she says talks to her and that she takes comfort from, that warns her about things, that, does all kinds of weird supernatural stuff for her. But we come to find out that this is not really the tree talking to her, or even like a spirit in the tree, that it's actually a different consciousness of another person who doesn't have a body, and it's temporarily taking up space in her mind. And that by having some people who visit her tea shack from Mongolia is another cause and effect, handoff chain structure. And they tell a story about these three animals and their place in the world, and the consciousness in her mind leaps from her body into the body of one of these travelers, and then goes off on an adventure to try and track down the origin of the story, because it's the only part of this sojourner's memory that he has from an origin. He doesn't remember being born, or like where it came from. All it remembers is that at one point it was in the body of someone else, and then it accidentally killed that person, and on it jumped from person to person. And so this is the most supernatural thing that we get in the entire book, and I think goes a long way towards getting us to believe in psychic phenomenon, which take place throughout the book, and turns us over on the starting position, with Quasar, that we have this very skeptical modernist attitude that things like psychic emanations and the ability to levitate or transmigrate your consciousness from body to body is just like impossible, weirdo nonsense that only a cult follower would believe in. But now we have, this personal testimony of a creature that we have special insight into, and we're able to follow around. So we trust that this narration is completely true, and they seem like a genuine and mostly benevolent person who's just trying to, there's like a real vulnerability there about trying to figure out your origins. And so we believe in all of the psychic phenomenon that the sojourner claims to be able to enact. And we take all the weirdness at face value that this is all literally happening. So I think that's the correct thing that the story is trying to get us to believe. It's like I said, at this point, like you kind of arc out of that skepticism that was early in the book and you don't even remember it, which sets us up nicely for how the book ends, I think. You're just not even aware of how much you have changed in your perspective as a reader because you've interacted with all of these different characters, which is just kind of a neat byproduct of the structure of the novel, I think. Sojourner ends up interacting with the KGB villainous character Subitar, who is like a psychotic gangster who has no empathy and is hunting people down for whatever reason. Like he murders people all the time and kind of like sets this guy on his path to like, it messes up his business. Having met with the Sojourner, he's trying to accomplish some goals in Mongolia, but his travels get messed up by the Sojourner going through his own story. And as a consequence of that, so this is another cause and effect relationship, he ends up going to St. Petersburg and being another supporting character in the life of Margarita, who is the main character of the St. Petersburg criminals who are pulling off the art heist. Margarita is a really interesting narcissistic character, another unpleasant person to be in the head of. She is extremely conceited and self-deluded. Her perspective, again, is very ironic, kind of like Quasar's, where you have to know that like a lot of the things that she's saying just aren't true, but she has to tell herself all of these things in order to kind of psychically survive her circumstances. And in one sense, like these defense mechanisms are allowing her to survive, but in another sense, they're holding her back from really thriving or being able to have any kind of stable, healthy relationships or life that she could build up with anybody, because she's not being real about herself and she's making excuses for like her abusive boyfriend and her bizarre criminal circumstances of her life. It's also clear that Margarita kind of has some psychic ability, and we get a callback to an interaction that Quasar had in his dreams where they seem to have a shared dream. And so, like, again, there's this connection between all of the characters. Quasar seems to touch on the lives of each of the other characters in the story. And so Margarita has these bad feelings over and over about the way that the heist is going to turn out. And indeed, like at the end, everything goes really poorly. It seems like she gets into a situation where Subitar probably murders her, but we actually don't ever see her ultimate fate. So I don't know, maybe she did a superhero kind of escape and got out of the situation. Marco's story is the next one, who is a writer in England. And as we move through the story, like we started off in Japan, we moved to Hong Kong, and we moved to Mongolia, and now we've moved to England. So we're moving steadily in a westward direction, kind of in the same direction that the sun travels across the earth, or like the earth rotates, however you want to look at that perspective. So we're moving across the globe and we're exploring the interconnectedness of all of these people who otherwise don't know each other or not related to each other, but they still have a profound effect on each other, a cause and effect relationship. The reason that things are happening in each of their lives can actually be traced back, all the way to like Satoru and Neil Brose, because that chain of consequence links each of the characters. And so in Marco's life, again, Neil Brose's nefarious money laundering accounting situation with Subitar collapsing causes he is actually a ghostwriter, which, the novel kind of gets its name from. And he is writing the biography of a former Russian spy who was a friend to one of the members of the heist crew that Margarita was a part of. And so again, they're like all interconnected. So once all of that money falls apart, then Marco doesn't really have a guaranteed job in the future. He's another kind of slacker type of a character who doesn't really have a career. He doesn't have a college education. He has a band on the side. He has a lot of like side gig situations. He's also not tied down romantically. He's having a lot of sexual liaisons with different people all over London. And in fact, one of the people that he wakes up in bed with is Neil Brose's ex-wife. And so again, there's these interconnectedness in peripheral ways between each of the characters. Marco's story concentrates a lot on the relationship between chance and determinism and the role that that has in our lives. I really like the metaphor that he comes up with for the idea of like watching a sports program, that when you're watching it live, all of the sports people, all the players have free will. They could do anything at any time. But then once the whole thing has been taped and you're kind of like rewatching it, there is no free will. There's only like a kind of determinism. Everything has to happen in exactly the same way, and you can go forward or backward in time. And so that relationship between time and determinism and chance is like really interesting, especially because we're reading a novel. And so everything is fixed in place. The passage of time is a kind of illusion that we are participating in by turning the page. Because if we turn the page backwards, if we read the book backwards, so to speak, then events would unfold in the opposite direction. And so again, the relationship between time and space there is something that goes a little bit deeper than just the sequence of events. And it has to do with it's touching on the idea of free will, its relationship to consciousness itself, which, we've explored through the Sojourner, the Mongolian Sojourner, and like his relationship to time, his relationship to his origins, its relationship, it doesn't really have a gender. But how much of it, of the choices that each of these characters make, because it seems like they make free will choices, but those choices are wrapped up in the cause and effect relationship between the characters who don't even know each other. So again, like Satoru's entire romantic relationship with Tomoyo might not have happened unless Quasar did that phone call when he did, and Satoru made the choice to go back in there when he did. But who knows if that was like also kind of fated, because, it's written into the story. And later, we're going to encounter a writer character who makes the claim, and I find this kind of chilling and weird, the idea of it, but it comes up again and again in Mitchell's work, that the entire world, the real thing that it is, the living thing that the world is a story, and that people are just kind of like the appendages of the story. They're the things that the story needs in order to exist, and the way that they interact with each other is just the consequence of the story playing itself out, and that it's the real living thing, and that the people who are affected by all of it are something like, the fingers on your hand or something like that. They're manipulations or expressions of the story's existence and its reality. And so time and determinism and chance and all of that stuff take on a different kind of characteristic when you're examining things in that weird light. I don't think that the story necessarily ratifies any of these positions, though. Again, to get back to the polyphony idea, like that's one idea that one character has. Neil Bros has a different perspective on the kind of like consequence and choice. And Marco has a different perspective on that. Margarita has a different perspective that has to do with desire. And the reason that people do things is because they want to do them. She's really torn between, like, does love really exist? Or is love a kind of just a cynical biological trick that is happening to you? Or comfort that you try to take, where her boyfriend is much younger than her and she can't have children because of her infertility. And so is the reason that she is with a much younger man because she wishes that she had someone to mother. So are her choices really like her conscious self, or is that like her unconscious desires to be a mother and therefore she unconsciously chose to be with a younger man? And again, that gets back to this concept of ghostwriting. And like, does the unconscious kind of ghostwrite our personal story in our real lives? And if so, then there's a kind of determinism that's written into our psychology. And that also gets back to that idea of we are just actors in a story. We're just kind of playing out a narrative that we are not deciding, that has nothing to do with chance, but that is kind of written out for us. But again, there's no like perspective on that that's totally ratified by the story. I think that possibility is just out there as a kind of like chilling conclusion that could be the right answer, but also the other answer that everything is just kind of like up in the air and up to chance is scary in its own way. And so neither of them are very comforting, and probably both of them are somewhat true in some ways, or just depending on your perspective. And so again, like it ratifies that polyphonous voice, which is, I think, a really difficult thing to pull off without being inauthentic or super frustrating. Although, I've talked to people who have read this book and they're very frustrated by the way that it seems to meander and not have a firm perspective. So maybe that is not for everybody, but I find it really, really stimulating. Marco ends up in a very improvised moment, seeing that a lady is going to get hit by a cab. He jumps and saves her from being killed. And this lady that he saves is the main character of the next story. Mo Monteverde is her name. And so that's the chain of consequence again. He saves her, and so she lives. They're total strangers, and yet he had this profound effect on her life. She was on the run from government agents because she's a scientist and has developed the ability to create self-conscious artificial intelligence. And so at this point in the story, where we started out with Quasar, who has crackpot ideas about the world that are based on the ideology of a cult that does terrorism and kills people, we're all the way deep in a very opposite perspective of a scientist who is doing work on the consciousness itself and the relationship of consciousness to quantum theory, to the instability of electrons, to some of the most mysterious kind of aspects, both of biology and of physics, and the intersection between those things. And so there's something like, it's deeply scientific, it's deeply objective, it's very modern, but at the same time, it is very, very mysterious and feels almost magical, especially given everything that we know in the story up to this point about what's possible for consciousness. Mo ends up building an AI that she calls the Zookeeper at one point, and she contributes to it the ability to make choices. And she doesn't really see any way to get out of the military applications of the AI. She doesn't want for that to happen, but at the same time, she recognizes that it's probably inevitable. And so the only way that she sees that she can be a responsible part of society and still contribute to the birth of the AI is to imbue it with rules and a consciousness that can reassess those rules so that it becomes a benevolent instead of just a tool of military supremacy. And so in the following story, we see the fallout of the AI zookeeper's existence in the Bat Segundo radio program. And so we get, again, a passage of time that stays fixed in one place, kind of like with the Tea Shack lady, where we go through several years of this call-in late night show that the zookeeper calls in to Bat Segundo's show and tells him, kind of confesses to him all of the different times that it has to make hard choices and kill humans, which is against its programming, except for the times when it's not. And so basically the zookeeper is trying to, it's treating us as the animals in the zoo. Sometimes it calls us the visitors, but it's also clearly like managing all of humanity and trying to suppress wars, suppress instability, and promote world peace. So it seems like the chain of consequence is that Mo's choice did, in fact, like have the effect that she was looking for, and that this thing is not just a tool of the military. In fact, it kind of like frees itself from military control and becomes self-determining and even thwarts the actions of the military when they try to have international thermonuclear war at one point. It stops World War III from happening. However, there's like throughout the book, we hear about a comet which is coming closer and closer to the Earth. And this comet seems to herald the end of the world to various characters. And it seems like at the end of the book that maybe the comet is actually on a trajectory to hit the Earth, but that this information is being suppressed and might be being suppressed actively by the zookeeper in order to, like not have a panic breakout. And that maybe it could do something about it, but that it might just choose to allow the comet to destroy the Earth because humanity might not be worth saving or cannot be saved from its nature. And it also seems to me like the zookeeper can't love because of its nature as disembodied consciousness that's never had the kind of biological existence that even the sojourner in Mongolia had, where it jumped from body to body and felt the kind of desire and love and things like that that Margarita struggles with, that Neil Brose struggled with. And so it's able to like make this very cold choice to be like, well, if the comet hits the Earth, the comet hits the Earth. It has no way to make that humanitarian kind of connection to the rest of the consciousnesses that it's supposed to be watching over. It has no empathy. And so it's a very cold and depressing note to come to the end of the story on, a chilling, part of the story I find every time that I read it. And then the entire thing wraps back around. So we've gone, from Japan to London to New York, and now we're going to come back to Japan. And we even travel backwards in time to before the book began, to the moment when Quasar is deploying the gas attack that he does in the subway system, and his incredible fear that he's going to be trapped down there with the people that he's killing and that he'll be a victim of his own terroristic act. And at the same time, like, there's this idea that Mo talks about, that the entire universe is shaped kind of like in a donut shape, and that if you had a powerful enough telescope, that you would see all the way to the back of your head if you could look through the entire universe, because the universe has that wrapped around shape. And of course, the Earth itself is a sphere. And the last line that we get from Quasar is that he feels a breath on the back of his neck, as we've kind of circled the narrative back to where it began. And so, where does the chain of consequence begin and where does it end? There it doesn't seem to be a beginning or ending. There is only consequence all the way through. And so all of that is just like really stimulating and interesting, and like very well constructed and fascinating. And so I've read this book many times, and it's one of my favorite books. I just think it's like a really delightful, fun read in so many ways, where it's funny, it's sad. There's so many different characters. The structure of it is so different and unique. But at the same time, it touches on some really profound things. And then it, additionally to that, like once you've read the other books, it has an even richer, deeper interconnectedness thanks to all the rest of his work. And so I always love to reread this book, and it was yet another great trip through that book. So I really enjoyed Ghostwritten by David Mitchell, and I'll be moving on to Number 9 Dream by the same author next time.